Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Asher tuku ingoa, no Aotearoa aho. My name is Asher, and I'm from New Zealand. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. It's been a really wonderful conference, and all of the talks have been really exciting. And also, this is my first time visiting the Broacha Centre, so yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you to the organisers for putting this event on, and replace someone else who pulled out. So the talk that I'm giving today is, I suppose, based off kind of a shorter presentation that I gave a few years ago for an animal law conference. And it's not based on a paper yet, but actually in the process of revising and updating the talk, I'm actually thinking now I might want to turn it into a paper. And yeah, I've had a lot of fun kind of going back into this topic. And essentially, yeah, I'll be talking about the ethics of pest control and balancing various different values, animal welfare, environmental values, human values, which includes, just maybe economic incentives and whatnot, but also Indigenous values in New Zealand. And yeah, I'm looking forward to giving the presentation. Cool. So basically, I'm going to try and answer the following 3 questions in this presentation. Here we are. So what is a pest? What ethical issues are presented by current methods of pest control? And how might future technologies such as gene drives resolve these issues? So yeah, first I proposed 3 different accounts of what a pest is, each of which draws upon a different set of ethical values, as I said, relating to humans, the environment, and animal welfare. And then I discussed some of the methods which are currently being used in New Zealand to control pests, such as baiting and trapping, and noting their negative effects on the welfare of pest species, which is something that's often neglected. And finally, I considered the potential for future genetic modification technologies to actually address these welfare concerns while also improving the effectiveness of pest control operations, and also reducing harms caused to the environment and to humans, at least more so than current practices that take place. So broadly, a pest species is a type of organism that causes out. So pests might be native to a given region, or they might be introduced by humans, such as for agricultural purposes, for recreation, or even just by accident. Common examples might include stinging or biting insects, such as mosquitoes, vectors for disease transmission, such as rats and mice, and animals that feed off crops and livestock, such as locusts, which cause economic damage. In all of these cases, we might also think of some organisms as pests because of the harm that they cause to natural environments. So invasive species, for example, are a type of pest which, while they sometimes interfere with the natural ecosystems and the continued existence of native populations or native species, such effects represent significant threats to biodiversity and contribute to the endangerment and extinction of native species, and at worst, ecological collapse within a given region. So while these are the 2 most common ways to define what a pest is, a third definition that I think might be useful, and which I'm actually exploring in my dissertation, considers possible harm that might be caused to individual animals, reducing their welfare from what otherwise might have been. And a good example of this, I think, might be the existence of certain parasites, such as blowflies, which have evolved to live on or inside the living tissue of their hosts. In this case, this is sheep, and just deriving nutrients at their expense. So we have 3 different accounts of what a pest is, defined in relation to harms suffered by humans, the environment, or individual animals. While the ethical values that are represented by each of these 3 concepts are different, it is worth noting that they often overlap in the practice of managing pest species. And this is especially true when we consider the ethical status of pest species in relation to cultural or Indigenous values, which often involve elements from all 3. So in New Zealand, for example, which is kind of where I'm going to be focusing on, given that I'm from New Zealand for this talk. So Māori identity, which is whakapapa, is directly connected to the history of one's tribe, the land and its inhabitants, and the Māori, which is the life force which binds them together. So based on this understanding of value, the recognition of a given species as a pest might already involve elements from all three of these definitions, since they're all already connected in a fundamental way. So it's more of a holistic conception of value, and it might be that defining what a pest is would actually involve elements from all three of these definitions. To provide a New Zealand specific example of this, one of the most environmentally destructive pest species in the country is the Brushtail possum. At a high enough population density, these animals can cause significant ecological damage by consuming vegetation at a much faster rate than forests can naturally regenerate, and estimated at 21,000 tons of vegetation per night, which on the Department of Conservation website, they have a leaflet. They say it's equivalent to 190 million standard hamburgers per night, which is, yeah, staggering. And not only does this cause damage to native flora by reducing flowering and fruiting, killing trees, and contributing toward the collapse of natural forest canopies, but it also threatens native fauna by effectively outcompeting them for food, which includes preying upon native invertebrates, in addition to eating the eggs and chicks of native birds. And this also reduces the number of viable locations for native species to find shelter. So yeah, a variety of different effects. It's also worth noting that these animals are significant vectors for bovine tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection that affects animals such as cattle, pigs, deer, and dogs. So many livestock species. And because of this, pest control operations, are not only important for environmental reasons, but they also have substantial effects on the transmission of bovine tuberculosis within populations of livestock, causing disruption to agricultural production and economic harm on animal welfare, which includes its direct and indirect effects. So for example, because of how quickly it spreads within populations of animals in New Zealand, there's a slaughter mandate suspected to have been in direct contact with other animals who have bovine tuberculosis. And I think it's also important that we consider the acute symptoms of the disease, which are likely to cause significant suffering for the infected animal. So many of these symptoms aren't obvious from the outside, such as general weakness, lack of energy, loss of appetite, weight loss, coughing, fever, and the development of swollen lymph nodes in the throat and lungs of affected animals. And while possums are often vilified in the debate about pest control, I think it's important to remember that they also have a welfare. And if we want to take animal welfare seriously, alongside other values within such debates, we have to also consider the significance of their suffering, in addition to, human or conservation related values. So this was just an example to show that often pest control, it doesn't just take place for one set of values or according to one conception of what a pest is. It involves elements from all three. So having established some of the reasons for why pest control might be ethically justified, we should now consider some of the current practices that take place. In New Zealand, we mainly use a poison nicknamed 1080 due to its effectiveness, biodegradability, and water solubility, meaning that it doesn't stay in the environment for a very long time. Generally speaking, carnivorous mammals are more sensitive to the toxic effects of 1080 poisoning than herbivorous mammals and birds, and even lesser so for reptiles and amphibians. So because New Zealand has no native land-based predators, it is possible to use this agent to target pest species, which include possums, rats, rabbits, stoats, ferrets, and others, while also causing minimal harm to native populations, which are largely insensitive to the poison. But still, there is a fair amount of opposition to 1080's use, and some of these arguments cite poor animal welfare as a reason to explore other alternatives. Although the harmful effects of 1080 poisoning are not as bad as other poisons that have been used in the past to control pests, such as strychnine and phosphorus, these are now banned for use in New Zealand. Lethal doses of 1080 do cause poor welfare, often presenting in the form of retching, vomiting, spasms, and seizures, with the possibility of epigastric pain and hypothermia, at least from my research looking at the effects in possum species, among other symptoms. This particular method of pest control also carries with it the possibility of sublethal dosing, in which the amount of poison an animal might consume falls just short of causing their death, resulting in the experience of poor animal welfare without any of the intended benefit of having removed a given individual or population from a given ecosystem. So yeah, it's not perfect. Another method of pest control that some consider more humane is trapping, specifically non-lethal capture traps, which allow animals to be euthanized relatively quicker and less painfully than if they were to die through poisoning, which can take anywhere from a few hours to a few days to take effect. However, non-lethal trapping methods like cage and leg traps also have the potential to cause significant amounts of suffering by causing accidental injury, and the distress that an animal experiences in the time that it takes before they are checked can sometimes result in self-mutilation and even acts of cannibalism within traps containing more than one animal. And while New Zealand legislation requires live traps to be checked within 12 hours of sunrise on the day after they are set, this is a very difficult rule to enforce, especially given the geography of New Zealand and how big it is and the land that's required to be covered. And yet there's no guarantee or there's no formal process for ensuring that proper guidelines are being followed for these welfare standards to actually be met. And then, last, kill traps might be considered a more ethical alternative if they cause death quicker, even if not so quickly or effectively as active euthanization from a human handler. They also require less maintenance to operate, since there's no time limit set on how often they should be checked. And in New Zealand, regulations permitting the use of snap traps require a loss of palpebral reflexes in under 3 minutes, meaning that, in principle, the suffering that an animal experiences should only last for a short duration before their death. But such traps do not always function exactly as intended, and the results of certain studies indicate between a 5% and 14% error margin, suggesting that while most of the time animals might be effectively killed within these stated guidelines, on occasion they are not. And I think the risks are pretty important to consider of significant prolonged suffering if it actually doesn't result in death, and then eventually dying by natural causes while stuck in the trap. So these are welfare issues I think are worth considering. All of these cases seem to present significant welfare issues, but they're usually considered justified on the basis that if such practices were ceased, many of New Zealand's native species would become extinct and our natural ecosystems permanently altered. Making the right decision, making the right ethical decision often requires that we consider potential trade-offs between competing values. And in this case, it seems that there's widespread agreement that the benefits of intervening in nature and conducting pest control operations outweigh the harms that would otherwise be caused. However, I think it's also important to recognize that current practices are only usually effective at suppressing populations of pests rather than actually eradicating them. So small island eradications in New Zealand are possible due to there being a smaller area of land to cover, in addition to, often there are natural barriers such as water or the ocean, which can prevent the reintroduction of pest species once they've been removed. But on the mainland, where the vast majority of pests live, this is a much more difficult task to accomplish, just given how much land there is to cover, in addition to logistical challenges which are often involved. So, for example, many regions are actually completely inaccessible by foot, and the use of helicopters is often required to conduct operations targeting local populations of pests. But this is obviously not, really a sustainable strategy for even if we can achieve eradication within a given region. This doesn't guarantee that that region will remain pest-free in the long term, given the presence of pests in neighboring regions. So if we want to treat the root cause of this problem, I think rather than just its symptoms, we actually need to explore alternative methods of controlling pest species that have a much greater potential to achieve a permanent effect. Trapping and baiting might be necessary to prevent ecological collapse in the present, but the New Zealand government has made a public commitment to the total eradication of all land-based predators by the year 2050, and expert consensus is that current methods are insufficient to achieve this goal. And also, if you think about it, the benefits would be enormous. Not only would this achieve animal welfare and environmental objectives, but it would also allow the government to more effectively address other important environmental issues like sustainable energy production or reducing climate change. by reallocating current funding being spent on pest control. And yeah, in New Zealand, this is about 150 million New Zealand dollars per year, which is equivalent to 97 million US dollars, for those in the audience who aren't familiar with the conversion rate. And this is actually quite substantial, given that our population is only around 5 million people. In addition to this, the annual economic costs of pests are estimated to be close to 6 billion New Zealand dollars. So we can also expect there to be substantial indirect benefits to the New Zealand economy as a whole. But, how can we hope to achieve this? If you would think alternative methods would have been explored by now, right? Well, I think for one, it's important to recognize that the battle against pests is actually a battle against evolutionary processes. Introduced species such as possums are simply better adapted than most native species to survive and reproduce within New Zealand ecosystems. And that's why their populations, are so successful at multiplying and spreading themselves. And this is especially true given the prior absence of any land-based predators within New Zealand, and the many opportunities these pest species have to take advantage of natural resources. So as someone who grew up in New Zealand, it would often be the case that I'd be going on a hike, and especially if I was going inland and it was a multi-day hike, you get to a certain point and the birds will just come up and, sometimes they'll just land on your shoulder or on your shoe if you're sitting down. And they're not scared of, land-based mammals at all. And so very, very vulnerable populations. But yeah, given the scale of this problem, changing the dynamics of the regular reproduction of pest species to eliminate the strong selection pressure might actually be necessary in order to achieve this more permanent solution. Various forms of wildlife contraception already exist and are being used across the world, such as hormonal contraception, the PZP and GnRH vaccines, which induce sterility, and contrapest. But these technologies all face the same problems as regular methods of pest control, which is scalability, just given the immense difficulty of achieving nationwide coverage, right? However, this is not the case for gene drives, which are a new technology currently in development alongside other genetic modification technologies such as CRISPR-Cas9, which I think we've discussed earlier in the conference. So what is a gene drive? A gene drive is, in essence, a tool that can be used to bypass traditional patterns of genetic inheritance, allowing for the spread of modified genes within populations of organisms to achieve widespread effects that would otherwise be naturally selected against by evolutionary processes. So think of it as a car and the edited gene as the passenger. The gene drive gets the gene to where it needs to go, but without the edited gene, the drive has no function, such as a car has no function without its passenger, right? Gene drives can be used to change the phenotype of a particular population of organisms. So for example, it could be used to spread genetic resistance to bovine tuberculosis within populations of cattle. And there's been some research done on this. Or they could be used for the purposes of suppression or elimination of populations of animals. And while both of these use cases are relevant to the debate about pest control in New Zealand, given the focus that this talk is looking at on eradication of pest species, I'll be focusing on the latter of these two use cases, which are elimination drives. So how do they work? Well, various different types of gene drive systems exist, but most notable of these are homing-based drives, which work by severing a selected section of the corresponding allele in the opposite chromosome to the one carrying the drive system, causing the cell to use the DNA of the introduced gene as a template for its subsequent repair, which you can see in the first diagram there. And when introduced into the reproductive cells of an organism, this essentially allows edited genes to be passed onto offspring at a rate greater than 50%, which is what you'd expect with traditional Mendelian inheritance. And these have actually been shown to sometimes exceed 90% inheritance, which is enormous, eventually leading to the spread of the edited gene within the drive system within the gene pool of a population of organisms. So you can see, on the second diagram, there's normal inheritance with an altered gene, and then if you pair the altered gene with a gene drive system, it can produce substantial effects for later generations of organisms, just given a few generations. So yeah, a possible way to induce, kind of, or to create suppression or eradication of a population would be spreading infertility or biasing sex ratios within a given population. So, for example, you could encode a gene such that like organisms only give birth to female offspring, and then eventually that will, lead to population decline. And yeah, a possible application, or probably one of the focuses of mainstream gene drive research, has been on using the technology to eradicate populations of mosquitoes, which carry the parasites which cause malaria, in addition to other insect-borne diseases such as the Zika virus, yellow fever, and dengue. But this could also potentially be used to control populations of invasive species within New Zealand, which would, in principle, successfully achieve economic, environmental, and animal welfare objectives that I've described before. But yeah, it's important to note possible risks that might be associated with this specific use case. So, for example, brushtail possums are native to Australia, and the unintended spread of such a drive system outside of New Zealand ecosystems could actually cause significant harm, right? However, such risks aren't necessarily as significant as they might at first seem, given the natural occurrence of drive-resistant mutations that would spread within the gene pool of an affected population. So given this mechanism, ordinary gene drives are not permanent on an evolutionary timescale, nor even in the short term, depending on how much an introduced gene reduces the inclusive fitness of affected organisms. And this is especially true of elimination drives, which by their very nature impose really substantial inclusive fitness costs to organisms by preventing or disrupting regular reproduction, to the extent that the successful elimination of a given population, even if it's a very small population, might actually require the distribution of like several drive systems. So it's not just like you release it in nature and then it has its intended effect. To overcome, this barrier, you would actually need to release, multiple drive systems in many cases. And additionally, even if this wasn't the case, there are also a variety of preemptive measures that can be taken to prevent the accidental spread of gene drives within non-target populations. And daisy chain drives are an example of this, which are created by splitting the components of a given drive system into a number of serially dependent drive systems, introducing a kind of natural expiry date on how long or how many generations it can remain active in the wild. So by utilizing these measures, the risk of accidental harm resulting from the use of a gene drive is actually, not as substantial as we might at first think, and it might be possible to engineer our way out of it. But yeah, it's still worth noting this is currently being researched, and we don't have many examples of these measures being taken in the wild to reduce risk. But anyway, on paper, elimination gene drives seem like they could have enormous benefits to the New Zealand people, the environment, and individual animals, at least in comparison to current methods of pest control, which are being used, which impose substantial economic costs, ineffective at eradicating invasive predators, and cause significant animal suffering. But yeah, we also need to consider whether this technology conflicts with Māori tikanga, which broadly refers to the knowledge and customs that have been passed on throughout generations of the Māori people. And earlier I mentioned the concept of whakapapa, which refers to an individual's identity, taking into account their ancestral history and relationships with the land. It's possible that genetic modification compromises the integrity of this concept, maybe not for humans, but actually for the possums themselves. And this would be, really bad. But then on the other hand, gene drives might not be considered to undermine this concept on the basis that such organisms don't already belong to the New Zealand environment, and modifying the genome of native species based on surveys that have been conducted would definitely be widely considered to be tapu, meaning inappropriate or violating traditional law. But this is not necessarily the case for non-native species. So there are questions involved, and it's not quite clear-cut whether or not the use of this technology would actually be tapu or considered inappropriate for non-native species. And then another relevant ethical concept to discuss is kaitiakitanga, which describes essentially an individual's responsibilities, duties, and obligations to protect the environment from potential harms. And this might include the threats posed by pest species. And yeah, ultimately, this highlights the need for open and honest communication with Māori communities, not only regarding the possible use of gene drive systems, but also just more generally to better understand their perspectives and increase their involvement within current and future pest control projects. And yeah, while there has so far been, only limited research attempting to understand Māori perspectives on the use of these technologies, a recent study found that participants were prepared to consider the use of gene editing on a case-dependent basis, especially when it aligns with Māori worldviews. And this might support kaitiaki. However, incorporating Māori values into this decision-making process would be necessary to obtain a social license also for the future use of such technologies. And it also would require close talks with local hapu and iwi, which refer to sub-tribes and tribes respectively. So yeah, it's ultimately seems very important that this discussion is involving Indigenous perspectives, as well as looking at other effects that I've mentioned. And so yeah, that's essentially the end of my presentation. I've just rounded it off with an illustration of Maui, who's a New Zealand kind of mythological figure. And this is a story in New Zealand mythology where he actually transforms into a kereru, which is a New Zealand pigeon, to fly after his mother. And so this, is kind of an example of actually there is, maybe some basis for morphological kind of transmutation. And yeah, maybe there's some link there. But yeah, thank you for watching, and yeah, I'd be happy to take questions. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's already kind of like a big push within science communication organizations in New Zealand, like the Royal Society Te Aparangi. They're trying to, obviously this technology isn't being used, and it's probably not going to be used, at least in the short or midterm future. But they're trying to promote kind of like spread information, not only from kind of like Western perspectives, but also explicitly relating the use of genetic modification technologies to Māori value systems. And yeah, their focus is very much on both education, but also just like getting discussion groups and publishing kind of like reports based on the perspectives shared by Māori communities in these discussion groups in response to the use of these technologies. So yeah, I kind of think it's I'm somewhat optimistic about the current efforts that have been taken that are very early in the process. I think that my perspective and the perspective of even some of the people who created gene drives several years ago is very much that the use of this technology without getting a social license from the people would be catastrophic, and would not only be extremely unethical, but would actually be pragmatically really, really bad, because it would actually, there's such a stigma regarding the use of genetic modification technologies already, and it would probably further that. So it's both ethically and actually pragmatically, if you really want to, save native populations, it's really important to not only educate, but also just involve as many people as possible and make sure that it's not just like, one authority making the decision whether or not this technology is used, but it's kind of like a collaborative decision, and various different perspectives are considered. Yeah, so obviously I'm a philosopher and not a scientist, so I couldn't give a really technical answer to that question, but my understanding is that at the moment, the sequencing of I guess like the genome and like better understanding like what edited genes would produce desired effects. It's still not at the stage where, like, even if we had widespread social license to use these technologies, that we could immediately do it, but it's probably going to happen in the foreseeable future. Insects are definitely much easier, and also possibly a much better kind of like a use case just to see whether or not these technologies can actually be used without having undesirable consequences. Because at least I think the unintended spread of a gene drive targeting mosquito populations, that there's not that much risk there, whereas there would be potentially if you targeted a possum population, because mosquitoes are considered pests all over the world, whereas possums aren't necessarily. But I think alongside kind of this getting a social license involving different perspectives, there's also a lot of New Zealand scientists are kind of like actively working on like the engineering problem of figuring out, okay, can we actually how can we do this, how long is it going to take, but it seems like the consensus of the people working on this is that it will be possible. It's just like a matter of when. So better that we have these discussions now. Yeah, so that's also a really good question, because obviously at the beginning of the presentation I brought up different definitions of what pest species are, and I definitely the species that are currently being looked at both worldwide and also in New Zealand specific contexts are kind of like species like possums, or also another one that's often talked about are wasps, which are also like represent significant threats and aren't really don't really have any seeming benefit for any set of values that you would consider. So I picked these cases because they're very in New Zealand it seems very clear cut, and it seems like you can actually achieve kind of like a you can take into account a wide variety of different value sets, and there are few objections, and so it seems like the risks are pretty low. But you can imagine in 10 or 20 years, if this technology is being used, and then we have like some people who see one species as a pest but others who don't. There's a lot of discussion about like feral cats being a threat to biodiversity and native species in New Zealand and in other countries as well. And so you could imagine like what if the debate ever shifted to, should we be using gene drives to control wild cat populations, which could have indirect effects on a lot of people love cats and would object to that use. And so there are questions to be raised there. I think probably it highlights the need to kind of like have maybe more ethical analysis of this, and actually maybe figure out like a decision-making procedure that would actually minimize the risk of potentially unfairly prioritizing one set of values over another. And I mean, we're in very early stages at the moment of considering the possible use of this technology, but that's definitely something that could come up in the future, and it's probably worth planning ahead so that we have a way to actually resolve those kinds of conflicts. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I mean, this is again something I probably haven't researched extensively to have a textbook response, but my understanding of vermin is that maybe it's more of like a narrow conception of what you could consider a pest, but like not all pests would be vermin. So maybe it would be something that's like dirty, or spreads disease, or something maybe that's actively hated by people, whereas it's kind of like pest species, maybe there's kind of an implicit they didn't ask to be there, this is the fault of humans for bringing them here, maybe it's not so expressly normative that these are bad organisms or something like that, but I mean that's kind of just speculation. I think it's probably more relevant just in the context of like CRISPR gene editing in general, just because that's obviously, that doesn't discriminate between which species we're considering. It could in principle be used for any biological organism. Gene drives, I think if we're just considering gene drives, the threat the direct threat might not be so big, because like the rate at which a gene drive can spread within a population depends on like the rate of reproduction for that population. So the risk, I think, for humans, given that humans take a very long time to mature and to reproduce, and we're very long living organisms, you know, the risk isn't as substantial if in comparison you have a rat who, you know, like maybe within a few months is of mating age and can have thousands of offspring over the course of its lives. And, you know, you can see like how quickly, you know, successive generations come into existence and how quickly this gene drive could theoretically be used to spread an edited gene within a population. So yeah, I think the focus of gene drives seems more on, you know, non-humans, and specifically non-humans who, you know, have much quicker rates of reproduction, because that's kind of essential for the technology to be successfully implemented. But yeah, CRISPR gene editing, that's super important to consider.